The Geneva Lecture Series is based on the conviction that excellent scholarship, art, and professional practice goes hand in hand with Christian faith. Since 1976, the Geneva Lecture Committee with Geneva Campus Ministry and our co-sponsors have brought about 70 speakers to share their insights with the campus and the wider community. In his recent noted book, Culture Making, Andy Crouch talks about how many Christians are very involved in analysis of culture from a worldview perspective. But he says the risk of thinking worldviewishly is that we will start to think that the best way to change culture is to analyze it. And certainly I come from a tradition that's big on analysis. We will start worldview academies, host worldview seminars, write worldview books. These may be of some real value, but they cannot substitute for the creation of real cultural goods. Culture is not changed simply by thinking. You've got to be doing. Well, tonight's speaker has long been involved in the creation of real cultural goods. David Herwaldt has an impressive resume of photographs that have been published in books and magazines, as well as numerous solo and group exhibitions. He's produced graphic art for many organizations, including currently the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics, and has won awards for his graphic art and his photography. From 1980 to 2002, he even produced and announced a weekly 2-hour radio show featuring blues music. Every time I talk to David, I learn something more. He's got a wide range of interests and abilities. He's also taught many others to create cultural goods as an instructor at Gordon College, Harvard University, the University of Iowa, Mount Mercy College, and many others. Educationally, he received a bachelor's degree in science and art from MIT, and then a Master of Arts from the University of Iowa in 2007. Now he's become more refined, I guess, so he's almost done with his Master of Fine Arts and also his certificate in the book arts. I want to say just one more thing about David that I find very interesting. In 1996, he writes, I decided to walk the Camino de Santiago, the medieval pilgrimage path across the north of Spain. I had concluded that to know what it means to walk with God, I had to know what it means to walk, to really walk. And so with the companionship of others, he walked 500 miles, discovering along the way that such walking can be done only in community. And he says, after walking the Camino, I knew that pilgrims must start wherever they are, and that their responsibility at any moment is not to jump to the journey's end, which is impossible, but merely to take the next step. No matter then that becoming like Christ can't be done, nevertheless, there is always the next step which must be taken. So it's our privilege now, and I invite you now to take a few steps with David as he speaks on holiness and the art of typesetting. Let's welcome David Herwaldt.
Thank you for coming. My work on this project began with designing the poster. And I had to design not only the front, but the back. And not only did I have to design the back, I had to keyboard all 70 names. I'm not complaining about the time spent keyboarding. I'm complaining about the humility that typing such a list enforces. Jim Wallace, Clark Pinnock, Os Guinness, John Perkins, Madeline Langle. I read Madeleine L'Engle when I was in the 5th grade. I would have crawled on my bare feet across glass to have been here in 1988 if only I had known she was coming here to speak. Owen Gingerich, the noted Harvard astrophysicist, Richard Foster, Cornel West. I mean, I could go on, and I'm afraid that the person who keyboards the next list of names is going to get to 2008, and Frederica Matthews Green, a quite well-known author, Lamansana, who probably is a very well-known historian, and if I weren't ignorant, I would have known him ahead of time, and they'll get to 2009, and they'll go, David Herwaldt, and he'll go, who the heck is he? If he's smart, he'll look a little further in all of the text, and he will discover that nepotism was involved. Worried that I might offend Ed by starting with this attempt at humor, I ran this by him, and he said, I got to the end of my joke, and I said, what was Jim Wallace not available again? He's been here twice before, why not a third time? And Ed gave me the truly humbling response, you're cheaper. So, there with my introduction and with all the preliminaries, we've exhausted the time. We'll see you next year. I'm going to try to talk about graphic design today. It's an interesting thing or project or cultural, what'd you call it, real goods? But most people, despite the ubiquity of graphic design, or perhaps even because of the ubiquity of graphic design, really have no idea what designers do. And I love this series of Dilbert cartoons. I think it's a little bit of evidence about how people regard us, basically with fear, because they don't know what we're going to do. We're doing something that most people regard as trivial and meaningless, and yet, you know, only death can release me, so bad graphics, what else? You know, that's Dilbert is summing it up right there, as if the design has nothing really to do with the content, except that when the content turns out to be a steaming pile of something that must go unmentioned here, Dilbert realizes that his competence is being judged by this thing that ought not in a just universe matter at all. Of course it does matter. Form and content relate closely. Form is content. That's the point that we'll circle around to in the end. I'm going to show you a lot of design tonight, mostly my design, because that's the design I can best talk about. It's certainly not the best design. So I thought before showing any of my work, I would show some work by some designers I think really know what they're doing. First among whom is the German Jan Tschichold, or some people pronounce his name Tschichold, who in 1928 wrote the book that this is an announcement for, Die Neue Typography, the new typography. It's a book that changed the world as we know it. Tschichold did all sorts of wonderful designs. This is a very famous movie poster design he designed sometime late 20s, early 30s, I'm not exactly sure. This is a book cover by Hermann Zapf, who in his 90s, I would think now, is still alive, still working in Germany. Though with associations in America, he had a long-time association with Hallmark cards. He was a calligrapher, a great type designer, and I would love to have seen one of his cards. It probably was one of the few that Hallmark released that wasn't drenched in sentimentality. This is a title page, not a real title page. He did not design Daniel Berkeley Updike's great book on printing types, nor did he do the title page for it. This is from a book of Zapf's called Typographic Variations, where he took existing books, and he was very modest in this. He didn't really fully explain what he was doing. You had to figure it out. He redesigned designs. That's more or less the original on the right. I think it's, yes, on the right. And you can see that Zapf's redesign, I hope you can see, I hope I'm not kidding myself, really is substantially more elegant. And it's more than just an increase in elegance, it's a better articulated message. The type spacing, the groupings of the various lines, they all make more sense now. He's clarified the meaning of the page, and he's really set up an expectation for how this book is going to treat the reader. Well, he would have had he designed the real book. The title page on the right is a good deal clumsier, not as clear, not as solicitous of the reader. This is a design by a German designer, Pierre Mendel, who works in Munich. Did a whole series of posters for the Bavarian State Opera Company. This is one of my favorites. I actually emailed them and bought an original, which yes, I saved from the flood. This is, in case you don't read German, or what would that be, Italian, I suppose, an opera about the return of Ulysses to home. And there's nothing here. There's blue, a gradient. This is perhaps the one time in the history of graphic design where a gradient really is absolutely necessary and wonderfully meaningful. And then there's this little sort of slightly modulated triangle. And with just a blue, just a gradient, just this little triangle, he summons up a whole landscape, a whole story. And it's like, whoa, it's the Mediterranean. That's not the Pacific. You know, it's the calm Mediterranean on a hazy day when you first can sight home again. And that's all in here. And there's nothing there, but everything is significant. The best graphic design, at least to my eye, to my taste, is really minimalist graphic design. There's almost nothing there, but there's enough there, and every detail is thought out. Every detail has meaning. It's not chosen because he liked it. It's chosen for its significance. And the best graphic design can sustain your attention for a good long time. This is a book cover by a really interesting Dutch designer, Melle Hammer. He's playing a wonderful game, and probably there are some Dutch readers here, so they may correct me, but I think it says first this, then that. Yes, am I correct? But he's playing a typographic game. You're having to read, you read sort of backwards. Yeah, and he's structuring your movement through the title in a really interesting way. And that's what designers do. They structure your perception of things. They create certain kinds of meanings. You know, obviously the author of this book created the meaning of the words. But those words then can be set in all kinds of different ways. And in their setting, they take on different overtones. And this is a very interesting setting. This is another one of Hammer's designs, just a beautiful, simple poster. Just really witty. It's as if the counter of the A really was a substance and it fell. Again, a very simple design by Alexander Gelman. This is a design for a poetry reading. What to me is really interesting here is he doesn't use the usual symbol of poetry reading, you know, which perhaps would be a book. There are all kinds of beautiful iconographic books. He could have come up with one of those, and he's actually a beautiful he makes beautiful icons. That's the way I should put it. Here he surprises you. He puts the reading lamp. It's as if you're at home reading, and it's a very interesting lamp. You know, it's a fairly modern lamp. It's not, you know, the lamp by which one would have read poetry in a Victorian age. Very symmetrical design, except for the placement of the type, which is just enough to give it a little life. Another one of his designs is for it's a poster for a executive recruitment company, and I'm not sure whether his really beautiful symbol of the globe is telling us that the world is getting bigger or the world is getting smaller, or maybe it's getting bigger or smaller. And very likely his design was designed to raise questions and to get us wondering about, well, what does this mean in this new global environment and this new global economy? Now I'm going to show some of my designs, and to give you a sense of how design works, I'm going to show you what I started with. I know a few of you are thinking, boy, I'm in really bad hands if this is this guy's design tonight. This is actually what used to exist. Had you been treated by the ophthalmology department here at the hospital, you might have passed out of the office and seen in a little stand this front cover. And had you been moved to pick up the brochure, you would have found inside a little questionnaire, and it would have asked you to tell the hospital how you've been treated. I don't know you, but I wouldn't have been enticed by this cover to stop and pick it up. They asked me to design one. So here, they've now changed a little bit. They want it to be mailed back, so I have the mailer on the back. This is my front cover. And this is the interior. Of course, all of this design went through a series of iterations, and I wish I could show you some of those iterations. I at least want to tell you what happened on the interior. When I was first given the text, I was given a good deal more text, and I set it in 9-point Optima, which, by the way, is designed by the great Hermann Zopp, whose title page you saw earlier. Then I was reminded I was designing for visually challenged people. Now, designers tend to like small type, and there's a reason for that. It's because of how a type block looks when you've designed with small type. It doesn't become individual characters. It is read more as a block. Okay? That's the designer's preference. That's how I preferred it. 9-point over 12-point. I worked out all these elegant little type blocks, neatly spaced, and then I was told it was useless because the people I was designing for needed larger type. And, well, what could I do? I had to admit I needed to change. Fortunately, the client also eliminated a good deal of the text, which allowed me then to make the type 20 or 30% bigger, go to 12-point type, and I didn't manage to get the blocks of type to work quite as I wanted to work. I would have needed another day, which the ophthalmologist wouldn't have wanted to pay for, and that's fair. So this is pretty much where we ended up. There were actually a few modifications made before. It's going to the printer, I believe, tomorrow, Leanne. Leanne, my boss, is here, so. This is a job that Leanne just gave me. This is again, not my design. This is the quick reference clinical guide. This is a basically 8-page guide, big accordion fold that stretches way the heck out. And this lists every doc and every department at the hospital. And this is printed in a huge quantity, 15,000. I suppose it goes out all over the state of Iowa and perhaps into some adjoining states as well. And it's on the desks of doctors everywhere. So when they need to refer their patients to a specialist, they grab this and they look down the list and they call a specialist. This is one page from the interior. When Leanne gave me this project, this is the map on the back. I immediately started asking her question after question after question. Do we have to use that map? It's an ugly map. It's a bad map. You can't really tell here, but it's a bad digital file. The previous designer had to make it a little bigger than it wanted to be. And its resolution, or lack thereof, was showing. I asked her, do I need to run the type that small? Man, does it need to be an accordion fold? Does it need? And designers always start projects asking questions like this. There's a joke that we often tell in design classes. How many designers does it take to change a light bulb? Does it have to be a light bulb? And when one is a teacher like I am, one often gets irritated by such questions. Yes, kid, it has to be a light bulb. But actually, the impulse that the kid is beginning to act upon in asking that question is a strong and important impulse in designers. You ask the most obvious questions because you get useful answers. And even when the answer is yes, it has to be a light bulb, that's useful. One of the interesting, strange things about graphic design, and I think this does in an interesting way tie into faith, is that constraints aren't disadvantages. They are actually the keys to the solution. That's where you begin. You figure out what the constraints are. If Leanne had said, yes, it has to be a 4-page accordion fold, and yes, you have to use this map. Well, I wouldn't have been happy about using the map, but I would have used it, and I would have made the accordion fold work as good as it could, and if I had to use the type this small, I would have. In fact, it's still an accordion fold, but there's some question as to whether it has to be an accordion fold, and we may make it a brochure yet. But that's my map. Ooh. Okay, so I spent a lot of time looking at the previous map. Do we really need to know that Iowa City ends just outside the airport? I don't think that's important for prospective hospital patients. I thought pretty long and hard about, well, what do they really need to know? If you're coming here from western Iowa and you've never been to Iowa City before, you probably want to know about all of the highway interchanges. You want to know how you're going to come off. You want to know exactly which are the major roads that get you from the highway to the hospital. You want to know where the parking is. Now, the parking was in the other one too, so that's not any great stroke of genius on my part. Now, you'll see in just a moment, I'm managing to get the type a good deal bigger than it was in the original version. One of the ways I'm doing that is taking the cover, which used to be decorative, its only function was to attract, and now I'm making the cover actually carry some function beyond decoration. It's actually using information that previously was on the back cover, which now will have the local hospital map. So by moving things around, I get to make, it's hard to tell here, but trust me, the type is significantly bigger. It's a lot more readable. And all this little typographic minutia, getting exactly the right line spacing, getting exactly the right type size, letter spacing, 14 hours of work. It takes time to work out all of those tiny little relations. And a lot of designers would find it boring. I find it unbelievably invigorating. It's just so interesting. And the thing is, it's important work. You know, this is the kind of work that a lot of designers think is dull, but this may determine whether a specialist gets seen here or somewhere else. You know, if the doctor in Sioux City is slightly visually challenged, he's going to take a look at the old guide and say, I'm not sending anybody to Iowa City. I can't even choose anybody in Iowa City. This is the hospital annual report. Usually this page is really pretty dull. By the way, I didn't design the whole annual report. The design of this was done by one of my colleagues in the office, Nancy Zier, who set up a really good grid. But I did the financials pages, so I did the charts and I did these tables. I act in this office in a slightly bizarre way. I'm very likely not to be there for long, and so I can really say anything without fear of like screwing up the rest of my life. And so when I got the numbers from Nancy, who was given them by the big accounting people, I said, these numbers in the order that we've been given them don't make sense. So we ran and looked at the previous year's annual report, same order. Apparently this nonsensical order is traditional. I said, Nancy, can we change this? Immediately, I want to know the constraints. Can I change the numbers and make them make sense to me? She said, I don't know, David. Well, the night before, I had seen a video, an interview with the head of IDEA, a big design agency, and he said, well, my practice is never to ask permission, but be quick to ask forgiveness. So I figured, okay, if it works for IDEA, I'll try it here. No permission, I did it, and what do you know? The accountants were down with it, and they noticed some ways in which I had sort of not quite followed the logic of my redesign and reordering of things fully to its conclusion. And they said, well, then we should do this. And we're going to have to actually redo these numbers to make them work within your system. And lo and behold, we have something that's really pretty clear, and I think for a page of numbers, fairly attractive. Now, another important part of the annual report is there are 13 pages of names of donors to the hospital and to the medical school. And originally this was not, I'm told, part of the plan for the annual report, but then it became suddenly a very important part of the annual report, and I got asked to do it. Again, it takes a number of hours, amounting to probably a couple of days, to fiddle with the type, to really figure out the optimum setting, to get the type to be readable, as economical with space as possible. But you know, if you've given a sizable chunk of change to the university hospital, you want to be able to find your name in that list. You know, so you really do want to pay attention. It's an important list. And I used illustrations that Nancy had done that got used earlier in the book as ways to enliven these pages and sort of tie them back into the pages with the more conventional text and the more conventional photographs that she really elegantly had designed to make a whole. Here are a couple of things I did for the University of Iowa Research Foundation. My client here is Rob Pennington is here tonight. The Research Foundation, you guys may not even know about it, but there are a lot of researchers here at the University of Iowa who come up with really interesting, potentially patentable, potentially lucrative ideas. So if they do, they run to Rob's office. Rob and his people look at all of the details of the invention. They try to figure out, is this patentable? Is it marketable? If it is, how are we going to do it? If they decide to take on some research, some invention, a discovery, they then have to try to market it. So they've come up with this really nifty idea. They have it's about to be unveiled. When does it get unveiled?
It's like a month.
But, I mean, this is a huge project where they've designed a website, a database that's completely searchable. If you're interested in cancer therapies, you enter cancer therapies, you get all of these references. You're interested in, you know, polymers, you know, or however one pronounces that word. You can plug it in and get these. They needed a system to accommodate all their data. So I sat down with Rob and we talked a lot. I started designing, he would respond. This is what we finally came up with. It's probably, to most of you, not terribly exciting to look at, but both Rob and I know we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we organize a massive data so people can make sense of it. And so that you've got a system so that in each document you know where to look for certain bits of information that may be relevant to you. And this is, what I'm about to say is just a, you know, indulge in a little bit of designer speak, but I'm really thinking about things like that empty space in the top row between the inventor's name and the URL. I'm really thinking about empty space. Empty space becomes really important, trying to open it up, trying to establish a visual rhythm across the space, the whole page. And I think we did a pretty interesting job. I can't wait finally to see the whole thing functioning as a website. The web design is in the hands of some geniuses up in Cedar Rapids. A lot of what we do as designers, to paraphrase the words of a very famous husband and wife team of designers, Charles and Ray Eames, the designers of the very famous Eames chair that you used to be able to sit in the art museum in front of the Jackson Pollock, you know, the leather chairs with the ottoman that you realized were the perfect chairs that were the Platonic ideal of chairdom that enabled the kind of sitting that seemed suggestive of eternity. Well, those guys designed, husband and wife team, Charles and Ray Eames, they designed that chair among many other wonderful designs. They were mainly architects and furniture designers. They did some graphic design, but designers looked to designers without regard to category for inspiration. And the Eames is talking about the role of designers, spoke of them as hosts. Your job as a designer is to anticipate every potential need of the person who is using what you are designing. And in anticipating that need, you're to supply it. And your design is really genius if it's supplying needs without those needs ever having been recognized or the fulfillment of them ever having been acknowledged. I see you laughing, and it is kind of funny, and it is kind of perverse, and it's, you know, it's kind of humiliating in a way, except it's really interesting when you're playing the game right. And here's a simple thing I did again for the hospital. Dr. Paul Rothman is the head of the med school? The dean of the med school. And he was having a party. They needed a map to show these directionally challenged medical people how to get to the Rothman's residence. And I took an afternoon and designed this map. Again, trying to think, well, if you're driving out there and it's dark, what do you want to know? How do I make it as simple and clear as possible? how one gets to the Rothsman's house. Nice little symmetrical structure that's broken a little bit so it's not too dull. It suggests a little bit of the variety of nature. Oops, oops, oops. Don't want to skip ahead. This again is a bit of design I did for CMG. I like the triple entendre of it. I'm surprised they let me get away with it, but they did. Now this is not triple entendres aside, a terribly remarkable piece of design, but I am showing it to you because remember, even when you're seeing something that seems pedestrian, you might be avoiding something much worse. This is what the client was trying to pawn off on the world. And some probably overworked secretary was asked, we've got this new service involving midwives being available at these particular clinics, design something for us. This was actually going out into the world as a representative of the hospital. This is a kind of snarky piece I did as a student, and I'm showing it to you in part to show you where part of the poster for the lecture came from. This is back in the reign of John Scorton, and Scorton asked the design program to submit potential Christmas card designs to him, and he and his wife would pick their favorite design and use it as the card for the university. Well, it, of course, couldn't be a Christmas card, and that was the whole point. I mean, it starts out being a Christmas card, then it's a holiday card, and you can't do anything that refers to Christmas. And while I don't really have much in common with Sean Hannity and his ilk, I do think that December 25th is Christmas, and the break around it is the Christmas break, and we perhaps might benefit from recognizing that fact. So I designed a 4-page Christmas card that did not make the cut. I do not believe Scorton saw it. This was the second page. You recognize it from the poster. The quotation that's running vertically and probably not readable out there is from Pascal, from the Pensées. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. This is the third page. Snark is perhaps not a noted Christian quality. This is a Christmas card I've designed more recently for CMG. Of course, I guess we can't say Christmas card. We need to say holiday card, but I pushed the boundaries as far as I could. A poster I did for the art school. They were doing a series of movie showings and concerts, Bergman films and performances by the Maya Quartet. I included this in part just to talk a little bit about design process. Design is interesting because sometimes you're given a lot to work with, sometimes you're given not much at all, sometimes it's great if you've got nothing because then you can use a blue gradient and a little triangle and summon up a cosmos. Sometimes you got to use too much. The client insists you use a lot. In this case, I was given access to film stills for all of the 4 films, and they were good stills, good quality, very interesting pictures, and I had a whole raft of pictures of the Maya Quartet, who are impossibly beautiful. They have no business in the classical music industry. They should be in Hollywood. And at first I thought, well, I need to use pictures for each of these films. I need to... And I just couldn't make it work. It was too much. I was juggling too much. And finally, I just decided, I really like this picture. It really seems to sum up for me what goes on in Bergman films. There's a lot of what I think of as psychological violence. You know, there's a lot of angst and despair and people hurting each other. Not so much physically, perhaps, but certainly emotionally. At least that's what I remember when I saw Bergman many years ago. So eventually, as I say, I chose this picture, started playing with the type. And I'm just playing with the type, trying to make it work. And I'm thinking, well, Bergman viewers are pretty smart. I can create a little bit of a puzzle. So I'm not telling everybody everything. And then as I'm starting to play with the type, I realize that that nice long line of type, Smiles of a Summer Night, is like a punch to her chin. You know, it typographically seems just a little bit aggressive, not quite as hard as a punch to the chin, but I think it underlines the sense of violence. Graphic designers like to play with what they call figure-ground relationships. The Gestalt psychologists late in the 19th, early in the 20th century figured out that whenever we see something, whenever we take in something through the eye, we see it as a figure against a ground, okay? And the word ground is essentially background. Designers have liked to mix up figure and ground. They like to create designs where what is ground at one point can be figure at another, and vice versa. So they slip back and forth. So a lot of the layering you see now in design is an expression of this interest of mixing up figure and ground. So when you're looking at the text, you really can't quite see the photograph. It's the background. When you look at the photograph, you can't quite see the text. It just blurs out. And so you have to switch back and forth. That interest has sparked a good deal of thought on my part. I've thought a good deal about what it means that we only see things against the ground, and why is it that designers like to mix up foreground and background and create these interesting designs. And of course we don't always do this. This would be fatal if we create an unstable figure ground on, say, a stop sign. That would be a very bad idea. But in designs like this, we often like to mess things up. I'm semi-serious in what I'm about to say, though I'm well in over my head in saying what I'm about to say. I think there may be a potential new proof of the existence of God, which perhaps is the first proof since St. Anselm's or whenever the last one was made. If we always see things against the ground, how do we perceive the cosmos? There's got to be a ground. Am I making sense? I mean, it's like we can't see anything without a background. It's the way the brain works. It's the way the eye works. It's the way it all works. Oops. This is a little student job, student assignment I just had to, and I would like actually to give it to Doctors Without Borders if they found use to it. I just thought it was really interesting that they had this name, Doctors Without Borders, as if, you know, perhaps this world shouldn't have borders. And then I realized, well, of course, from space, we can't see the borders. It's as if this place doesn't have borders. So I took a NASA photograph, which they make available for free, and huge pictures of great resolution, and borrowed it and made it into this. This, again, is a little student project. This is a spread from a book I did called Other People's Words. A play on, of course, the famous phrase, other people's money. I'm noted for quoting other people. I think a habit that developed in my family because my dad was always quoting people, and of course those people were often the writers of scripture. And I grew up quoting people as well, and one day a friend of mine said, "You have a way with other people's words." And apparently I do, since I quote them all the time. So for a book project, I decided to ransack my commonplace book and find a lot of quotations about design and put them together. You can see I'm playing with figure ground here. You know, I'm making you see the blocks of type as blocks of type. I'm really making the ground active. I'm not creating unstable figure ground here, but the ground isn't just negligible. It becomes part of the composition. Am I making sense? And the blocks of type begin to be seen as not only individual blocks of type, but as shapes that go together. And they're arranged to set up a slightly confusing reading pattern. Where do you start? Where do you go? Do you read across the rows, or do you read it conventionally up and down? You can read several ways through it. I'm going to show a few things here that I did for HANCHE, and then after we go through these, we're going to start getting to the sort of heart of the talk. You may be wondering if Holiness does have anything to do with typesetting. Despite my amateur attempt at philosophizing about figures and ground and the existence of God. I haven't said much about that yet, but we will touch upon it soon. I'm showing you all this less to show off and just to give you a sense of what designers are doing and how they're thinking about things, so to set up some of the discussion to come. This, by the way, was a very interesting play, which I unfortunately had to miss because of schoolwork. School always gets in the way of education. But it was about a Reinhold Niebuhrian figure, and it sounded like a really interesting play. It's called Horizon. So you can see what I'm doing with the type. I'm first of all really emphasizing the horizon, but second of all, I'm setting up the two blocks of type in relation to the figure so they suggest recession in space. You can look at them as if everything's flat on the page, or you can look at them as if things are receding in space toward the horizon. What we're doing as designers is creating relationships. Again, to refer to Gestalt for a minute, Gestalt psychology, which graphic designers think about a lot, can be summed up in a phrase: the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And basically what that statement says is that when you're designing, you're creating relationships. You're given these parts, but if you put them in a good relation to each other, you end up with something that is much greater than all of the individual parts just thrown into a basket and summed together. Simple little task, given a really good photograph of B.B. King and a few lines of type. The logo at the top's already designed. That was designed by my boss at HANCHE, really good designer, Ron McClellan. And I've got these few lines of type. I've got to relate them to what's going on in the photograph. How do I do that? Well, a lot with color, picking up colors in the photograph, making that part of the type. And I'm also doing various alignments, which I won't show, but you can perhaps see how various lines of type are lining up with bits of the photograph. So now we begin to get to the more serious part of the evening. And to talk about that in a moment, I'm going to read a little bit from an essay I wrote, which is about a book by Eric GILL. And that book is called An Essay on Typography, and it was first published in 1931, when its full title was, and you'll see a dust jacket later, Printing and Piety, an essay on life and works in the England of 1931, and particularly on typography. So you can see more or less where I stole the title. Printing and Piety, Holiness, and the Art of Typesetting. Gill, I think, is a phenomenally important and interesting artist. He's one of the few major artists of the 20th century, major visual artists, I should say, since there were quite a few literary artists and musical artists to profess Christian faith. But he was one of the very few unassailably major artists to profess Christian faith. He's pretty much disappeared from people's memories these days, except for his typeface Gill Sans, which is probably on all of your computers, and we'll get into that later. But I wanted to tell you before we get to a discussion of his book and what conclusions I've drawn from his book and how those conclusions have affected my work, to just tell you a little bit about this guy. He was the son of a nonconformist English pastor. Like most sons of pastors, he went through a rebellious period. Mine wasn't quite as extensive as his. Unlike Gill, I never lost my faith. He did. This golden calf of 1912 was during the interregnum between his loss of faith and the regaining of his faith. He was asked by a woman who I believe was the widow of the playwright August Strindberg to do a sculpture for a club that she planned to open, I believe, in London. And this club was to be the center of well, I don't know what exactly, but there was a rather dissolute bunch, and they were going to have a really, really, really good time. And they wanted to name it the Golden Calf, and GILL did the calf. Not long thereafter, he decided he had had it with his rebellion, and he thought a lot about what he believed, and he realized that he was creating a religion of his own, as so many people do. Then a little while later, he realized that the religion of his own that he had created was Roman Catholicism. Who knew? He joined the church. All through this time, he is becoming one of the great letterers in England, and he's doing carving and he's doing book lettering, and this is a carving he did for the poet Francis Thompson, the author of The Hound of Heaven. He did G.K. Chesterton's gravestone. He did carving for Oscar Wilde's gravestone, which I believe is in Père Lachaise in Paris. His carving is all over England. I can't wait to go and watch or look at it. He did a lot of book illustration. This is for the famous Four Gospels, published by one of the great private presses of the time, the Golden Cockerel Press. He did the Stations of the Cross at Westminster Cathedral. He also did the War Memorial at Leeds University, a war memorial that perhaps will have renewed relevance today. The issue of money and finance was for him, as it was for, in a different way, for the poet Ezra Pound and for the essayist G.K. Chesterton. Well, Chesterton was much more than an essayist. A really important issue. They had somewhat similar ideas. GILL was very much against the capitalist system of banking. He thought it was quite oppressive, as it seems at this moment to have been all along, though for a good while we forgot. As I said, he designed the face GILL Sans. He did it sort of under protest. He thought type design was an almost unforgivably industrial activity. He thought industrialism was a very bad thing because we were the creatures of God, and God was a maker, hence we were makers. And he thought that industrialism deprived men and women of the possibility of being makers. They were always just automatons following somebody else's direction. That was very important to him. But he did eventually consent to design this great face, GILL Sans, which is a wonderful face, because the faces at this time, like Paul Renner's equally great face, Futura, were being influenced by modernism, and they were mostly in love with the machine age, and they were all about geometry and so-called objectivity. And GILL's face seems to be that, but is actually in a lot of subtle ways, I think, a kind of protest against that. Look at the lowercase g, which you can see really quite big in the name of his printing firm, Hagen Gill. Look at it sideways, turn your head to the side, and you see what the model for the lowercase g is. Yes, he admitted it. He joked about it. It's a pair of glasses. There's a lot of humor in this, and I think some of it he intended more harshly than we feel it now, perhaps. He did not like his time, and much of his life and much of his art was a protest against his time. By the way, this poster right now, printed in GILL Sans, is the rage. I discovered it on the internet, just ordered my own copy. It should arrive any year now from England. That's GILL Sans. The original was a World War II poster, didn't get much circulation then, and it has obviously, given the current parlous state of the world, a new relevance. I think it'll look good should I get a teaching position in my office. The top is the book jacket of an early version of an essay on typography, and you see the full title, Printing and Piety. GILL wrote voluminously, essay after essay after essay, book after book after book, letters which have been collected, an autobiography. He died very young. How he did all he did in the very few decades that he had on this earth, I do not know. An essay on typography is the one of his many books currently in print, and David Godine, a fine publisher in Boston, is keeping it in print for lovers of graphic design and typography. The jacket below is the current jacket, or actually it's only available now in paper, so it would be the current paper cover. And you'll see that the full title has been suppressed. Now it's only an essay on typography. Perhaps the full title, Printing and Piety, would depress sales even further than they're depressed now. Fortunately, it does survive in the introduction to the book. I often show this to students, and I'll ask you the question that I ask them. Do you think this spread is a remarkable piece of design? I'm seeing one head moving bravely, going this way. No? No, of course not. You've seen only this one scan. You've never heard of the book before. And now you don't have a chance to read it. And even if you did read it, the experience reading it here would not be the same as reading it in a book in your hand. Fundamentally, your relation to the text has been vastly changed by mediation. This is not the same effect. You're right to answer the question the way you answered it. And in fact, even if you were reading it, you might think, this is a really wonderful book. I've never thought about typography this way. And then if you ask the question, but did the typographer do an interesting job? You might well answer no. Even I, the first time I read it, was disappointed. It's like, Mr. Gill, you know, didn't you have any ambition that day? Here I would like to revert to my essay. Forgive me for reading now. I'd much prefer to speak extemporaneously, but I think to be clear, I want to read. It's an unprepossessing book with pages that will not at first glance strike most readers as elegant or particularly interesting, but those who go on to read those pages after having been perhaps initially disappointed by them may slowly cotton to the fact that Gill's book reads with unexpected ease and therefore with surprising pleasure. You'll just have to believe me on this, or go to the library and get a copy and test whether I'm right or not. Much of the ease and pleasure of reading Gill's text follows, of course, from the writing itself. He was a really good writer. Very repetitious, like a lot of evangelicals, of whom he was one early on. He believes he has the truth, and he believes the only reason you don't believe it is that you haven't heard it enough. And so if you don't believe it now, he'll repeat it. And if you don't believe it, then he'll repeat it again. But as long as you can tolerate the repetition, he's a wonderful writer. He's concise. Or if you read just any one of his books, you'll love them. If you go on to read most of them, as I have, after a while you start to think, well, Eric, I've heard that before. As I say, much of the ease and pleasure of reading Gill's text follows, of course, from the writing itself, but his design, without calling attention to itself, makes its own felicitous contribution to our experience. The specifications with which graphic designers are concerned, page size, margin width, measure, the measure is the line length, typeface, type size, leading, word spacing, justification. He's not fully justified it, he's left it ragged right. What that enables him to do is make every word space exactly the same. The eye always knows, where's the next word? It's the same distance as the last one was. It's always the same, no surprise. We're chosen with Gill using one standard, solicitude for the reader. The usual cosmetic or economic considerations seem to have been given no consideration at all. With pages only slightly bigger than those of a pocket paperback, the book is sized to be easily held in one's hands, but there the comparison with most paperbacks ends. Unlike the designers of most paperbacks, Gill didn't cram his pages with as much type as could be made to fit to keep the costs of production low. Rather, he designed pages with outside margins roomy enough that even thick fingers could hold his book without covering text. His type is set at a size to be readable even when the book is held at a comfortable distance. His type size and line length are coordinated to work together to put an easy eyeful of words on each line. You guys know the opposite. You've been reading a lot of badly designed academic texts. How often do you stop, get lost, 2/3 of the way across the page, have to go back to the beginning, start again? How tedious is that? It's because, well, A, the guy couldn't write, but B, the designer was forced, probably by a penny pinching jerk of a publisher, to put too much text on the page. Rarely, if ever, will a reader get lost in the middle of a line. Gill's text is set flush left, ragged right. Such a setting produces far fewer of the hyphenated words that in fully justified settings cause readers to hesitate at line breaks. Now, he does permit himself some hyphenation. He's not a complete rationalist, but he's tried to minimize it. He's done just enough hyphenation to keep a fairly smooth rag, as graphic designers call it. Gill didn't design a book that foregrounds its own formal beauty and his genius. Rather, he designed a book that serves its readers well by being extraordinarily readable. And I really do mean this. His books are just amazing books to read. And you have to force yourself to be aware of it, because it's like a fish swimming in really wonderful water. It's like, well, you don't notice it. But then when you do, you're just very, very grateful. Near the end of the book, Gill wrote a passage that suggests why he troubled himself to do so. The discovery then, here I'm quoting Gill, of what is meant by pleasantly readable involves more than questions of eye strain, important though that question is. It involves first and last a consideration of what is holy. Now, that's a wonderful sentence, and one wants a little more, frankly, and one has to do a fair amount of thinking on one's own to try to figure out what he meant by that. But in the context of his thought, it seems pretty clear that what he's talking about is the fact that holiness for him involves the sense of right relation between him and his maker, God, and him and his fellow creatures made in the image of God, his readers. And in designing this book, he's thinking of it as a holy act because he's thinking of himself in relation to God. He's a maker. He's making in the image of God. But he's not godlike. He's not trying to impress you with his godlike powers. He's rather trying to serve his fellow human beings and make a book that's really wonderfully, gracefully readable. A lot of the best designers, picking up on Eames's idea mentioned earlier, think of themselves as servants. There's this whole sense of, I'm here to serve the text, I'm here to serve the reader, I'm here to serve the message. And of course, we Christians know the words of the New Testament. If you want to lead, how do you do that? You serve. So that's, for me, a really governing thought. It's a big part of my practice as a designer. It's how I proceed. It's trying to always figure out, well, how do I serve the task? How do I get the hospital's message across to the people who need to hear it? How do I make a playbill so that it's readable even in a dimly lit auditorium just before a play? How do I... It's not about my own genius, it's about service. I was really interested this weekend while I was in the throes of preparing this talk, among other things, to see an article online by the very fine writer and teacher of writing, William Zinsser, whose book on writing well is now in everybody's home who's trying to write well. And his article is very interesting. He talks about the various editions the book has gone through and why he's made changes and how he's changed in writing and how that's changed his book. And he said something really interesting about halfway through the article. It now occurs to me, Zinsser said, that I didn't really find my style until the late age of 52, after already doing several editions of the book. Until then, my style more probably reflected who I wanted to be perceived as, the urbane columnist and humorist and critic. Only when I started writing as a teacher and had no agenda except to be helpful did my style become integrated with my personality and my character. And that really struck me. I mean, what he's saying is he found himself when he gave up thinking about himself as an artist. Am I being clear? You know? And it's one of the really interesting paradoxes of art making, and in particular of graphic design, that the best way to go about it is to forget yourself, lose yourself in the task, and then in the end you wake up at the end of the job and you realize, well, there I am again. You know, you really do find yourself in losing yourself in this thing. I do my jobs the way I do them because of who I am and who God made me, I suppose, and my fellow designers do their jobs in the ways that they've been gifted to. I think we always do best, however, when we forget ourselves in the midst of the task. And yet in the end it always somehow is us. You know, so Louise is here. Her jobs are, you know, designed by Louise. They wouldn't have been designed by me. Nancy's jobs are, Leanne is here as well. They're going to look like Leanne, and my guess is, I haven't talked to them about these issues. I'm not sure that they think about them in quite the terms that I think about them, but I think we do our best work when we don't think about ourselves, rather when we get lost in the task. Another one of the really great inspirations for me has been the Shakers. On a whim, a couple of years before I came to graduate school, I just went out and visited Hancock Shaker Village in western Massachusetts. I did a series of photographs that I've since designed into a little book. I'm going to show you a few of the photographs here. The Shakers are really interesting people for a whole number of reasons, but among them, they took design seriously. And outside of the Roman Catholic community, which for a long time has taken art and design quite seriously, Christians for the most part haven't, particularly evangelical Christians. And my suspicion here, and again I'm in way over my head in saying this, my suspicion is that a lot of evangelicals are really closet Gnostics, and they really don't want to take creation and the incarnation seriously. And we'll return a little bit to that at the end. And there is a little bit of closet Gnosticism indeed in the Shakers. I mean, they really can't deal with the way we humans create more human beings. And unfortunately, in not wanting to think too much about that, they also didn't really think about how they might create a continuing stream of Shakers. There now are only a few left. But they really did devote a great deal of very serious thought about what it means to live in this world and what sort of stuff we ought to be surrounding ourselves with while we're here living. And it's the kind of stuff that you can't necessarily get by going to the neighborhood Walmart. It really is very carefully designed stuff. And it really is extraordinarily beautiful. And it's all deeply involved with the idea of function. What does this need to be in order to do what it needs to do? The Shakers weren't interested in self-expression. They indeed forbade their furniture makers and architects and painters from signing their work. That hasn't prevented the art historians from trying with their wonderfully subtly deductive methods to try to figure out whether brother so-and-so did this chair, this chair, this chair, and this chair, as if that might matter. It doesn't. The Shakers made their work as a community, and they died as a community. They were buried, at least at Hancock, under one gravestone. God would sort them out. The final spread in this book is a spread of Shaker design proverbs, I guess we might call them. If they were assembled and had been published under a name other than the Shakers in the early 20th century, we would have had a manifesto to rival any of the Futurist or De Still manifestos. It's a brilliant thing. If I had to limit it to one or two quotations, I would point out that one. All beauty that has not a foundation in use soon grows distasteful and needs continual replacement with something new. When you think in terms of function, you create beauty and it's lasting beauty. When you think in terms of fashion, what's hip today? Well, I mean, we know what afros look like now. We know what bell bottoms look like now. Dang, Dad, did people really look like that back then? The other one I really like, of course, is a man can show his religion as much in measuring onions as he can in singing glory hallelujah. And I like to think, of course, that a man can show his religion as much in how much he cares about proper letter spacing and achieving a nice balance of text to produce graceful readability. I'm going to close showing a few spreads from a book I did of poems by Emily Dickinson, because I think this points to another really important thing and allows me to get back to that whole incarnational and Gnostic thing, and perhaps provoke some more laughter at the shallowness of my theological thought. Dickinson did not in her lifetime publish a poem willingly. There were a handful of her poems published, but apparently friends of hers or somehow people who got their hands on her poems snuck them into publishers. She did circulate her poetry a little bit. She circulated it in handwritten manuscripts. So if you were a friend of hers and you were privileged to read her poetry while she was alive, you might get a piece of paper like the piece of paper you see on the right. She never willingly allowed her poetry to be set in type. This little project that I did compared 7 of her poems in typeset versions. I used the type spectrum, which was an mid-20th century design by Jan van Krimpen and designed for actually use in Bibles. I thought that was a nice allusion, I suppose. And so I'm pairing the typeset version of the poem with her original handset version of the poem, and with whatever other fragments of the poem of other poems happen to be on that sheet of paper. And I'm asking the reader to ponder, what's the difference between reading it in my typeset version and reading it in her original handwritten version? And I think there is a difference. You know, it becomes much more formal in type. It has much more the feel of her on the paper. It would have had even more of a feel connecting the poem to her if the scans had been in color and they had been better scans. I scanned out of a book that was produced for scholars, not for people who really wanted to see what kind of paper she wrote on and to see the impress of her pen in the paper. But still, just in her handwriting and in her emendations, she often wasn't sure of the language she wanted to use. So for here for instance, there's an asterisk. She's considering, where's the other asterisk? I can't see it right now, but maybe out in the audio, right here, right there. She's considering, does she want to say it as she said it there, or does she want to rewrite it as below? Those sorts of changes never survive into the reader's versions of Dickinson's poetry. They may survive into the scholars' editions of her poetry, but they're not available to most of us. And I think that's important to know that this very great poet was wondering, do I want to say it this way or do I want to say it that way? And she gave her readers both. Editors tend to give us one. In any case, the big idea here is that design is incarnational. You know, designers are always dealing with this issue of form and content. And content, in this sense, is usually thought of, well, if we're dealing with a poet, the words. But it's a trickier issue than that. If a designer does his job well, form and content really become one, as it were. They mix up. The form becomes part of the content. The form, well, in fact, even if the designer isn't thinking about it, the form still becomes part of the content, because if a bad typesetter typesets Dickinson's poems, that influences subtly in a way that you don't really pay attention to your reading of the poem. And I think there's actually a good deal of wisdom here, you know, pointing to the reality of the world. We like to think, you know, as Sting sang in that great Gnostic anthem, we are spirits in a material world, as if, well, you know, we really are called to this better place, like we should get out of here into the spiritual realm. I think Christians can't believe that. You know, this isn't quite the place it should be, because we screwed up a while ago. And we screwed up really seriously. And we fell. And when we fell, there was a lot of damage. There was some shattering. Things fell apart. An original unity was broken, and it's not fully repaired yet. Pardon me just for a second, let me. What we as graphic designers are doing in our clumsy, modest, hidden ways is, in each of our designs, trying to restore a sense of unity of form and content. Am I making myself clear? Everything we do in a small, humble way is a token of grace and a hint of redemption. Thank you.
Now, if we have a little time for questions, comments.
When you worked with this design here, and I know the convention, what did you do with the fact that her line breaks are at different points? I mean, she's short and easy than her handwriting, but it's still a different thing.
Repeat the question.
Oh yes. The questioner is asking me, how did I handle Dickinson's line breaks? Because her paper seems to be fairly narrow, and it seems like her lines would have continued had the paper been wider. And I mean, it's a very interesting question. I can't tell you, I can't remember exactly what I did. This project actually began in my first year of graduate school, so it's close to 5 years old now. I do remember agonizing about these issues, and probably in the end what I did was follow the accepted line breaks in the major scholarly edition of her poetry. But it's a really interesting question. Is it really the case that the paper is too narrow, or did she want that break? And over again, you're having to make assumptions. It's no easy matter to translate text into type, even before one gets to the typographic specifications. Right now I'm working with my sister on a little project, and it's amazing how many questions there are of interpretation. Do we do it this way? Do we do it that way? We've referred some of the questions back to the authors so they can help us decide. Of course, with Dickinson gone, there's no asking. So one has to interpret. And each interpretation, of course, is open to question. And it becomes part of meaning. You know, I mean, one of the really important things is, and you know, it comes up in the beginning of every art education, is everything is mediated. You don't get anything that's not mediated. And you have to start thinking about the nature of that mediation. And certainly I'm mediating in fact, in different ways, I'm mediating the approach to Dickinson's text on both pages. Even where I'm apparently giving you her unmediated text, I am not. It's in subtle ways mediated, and that changes things. The only way really to get to her text would be to go to the Beinecke Rare Book Room at Harvard to look at those pages, which you could do. But even that would be mediated because you'd have the whole atmosphere of Beinecke. Is that at least a partial answer to your question? Yes?
Most Bibles given out at confirmation classes, remembering my own, are very difficult to read.
Yes. And they're very badly designed in a host of ways, and we can talk about them, but you know, one of them is the introduction of these things that I am pretty sure the original writers of the text did not use, those verse numbers. You know, they are useful, but again, it's really interesting how just the presence of verse numbers changes the way we read and think about Scripture. We think of it in verses, and that's not the way it was intended to have been thought in. I'm actually thinking about trying to do my own 4 Gospels, because I'm really interested in I've long wanted to do a study of the Gospels where you compare stories of the same event from the different Gospels and then try to set the story told by the 4 Gospels, insofar as one can, in chronological order. So I guess you have to start with John, in the beginning was the Word, because that clearly was before anything else. And then you go on. And I've begun arranging the texts in what I, in my uneducated way, have thought might be chronological order. And as soon as I get a chance in the future at some point, I'm going to try to design a setting of this thing that encourages a different kind of reading. But it's really a difficult issue. And you know, it begins with the economics, because you've got this big text and you want it to be small and affordable, and you want it to be portable.
But you want it to be read.
But you want it to be read, and you want it to be incarnate in a form that bears some interesting relation to the words and to the story it tells. And there are some Bibles that have done an interesting job of dealing with at least some of those issues. though some of the best designed Bibles are lectern Bibles and are good only if you have it here. Very great designer, Bradford Washburn, designed a great Bible in 20, I mean, we can go on and on. There's a lot of lectern Bible design. You know, if you had a spare $50,000, you could buy GILL's 4 Gospels, and it would be beautiful. And it would inspire you to read it if you dared to open the pages. But it's a really tricky issue. But I agree with you, most of them are very badly designed, and that gets in the way of reading.
Any other questions?
What do you think is the digital impact, what's the impact on your field from the digital age? How has it affected it for the good or bad?
Repeat the question.
The question is, that's right, I forgot to repeat Paul's question. But probably my answer carried Paul's question along with it. The question here is, how has the digital age, for good or for bad, changed design, I think is essentially the question. Well, it's changed it incredibly, and mostly for the good, I would say. The one perhaps, well, there may be 2 downsides. One is it's made it seemingly a technical matter. You know, it's made a lot of people think, well, if I know the software, then I'm a designer. The software is in one sense nothing, but it's a great convenience, and we'll get to that in a second. What was the other downside I was thinking of? That slipped my mind. Well, you know, it certainly unleashed a lot of bad desktop publishing, but you know, there was a lot of bad typesetting before, and you know, just because typewriters exist, you know, there are a lot of bad writers who are enabled as well, and I don't see the writing people complaining too much, so I don't think on that ground designers can complain. It's pretty clear, I think, when something has been thoughtfully designed and when it hasn't, and I don't really care whether the person who designed went to design school or not. You know, I'm not standing here to defend my profession and, you know, insist on standards like some of my colleagues would. I think some people can do it well innately. I think most people do it badly until they really think about it. So certainly computerization has enabled bad design to be perpetrated more easily. But it's also made some things wonderfully easier. I mean, in fact, as we were driving over here, my brother-in-law Mark was asking me, how would your preparation of this talk have been different before computers? Well, it would have taken, I don't know, 3 months. You know, to put these slides together would have taken forever. And this is a lot easier. Typesetting is a lot easier. Typesetting, in one sense, by the way, this is both an upside and a downside. A lot of the type, this type here, Jan van Krimpen's Spectrum, was designed mid-20th century for printing with lead. Okay? So it was actually, I believe, a linotype face before it was a monotype face, so I may be wrong on that point. But it was designed to be printed in lead. And so when you put ink on paper with lead, certain things happen. One thing is that the lead gets pressed into the paper, so you get a little impression. But the ink also spreads in certain ways with letterpress printing that it doesn't necessarily spread with offset or digital printing. So you can't just take a look at the original drawings that Van Krimpen made for Spectrum and copy them to digitize the type. You actually have to do subtle changes, and a lot of those subtle changes, in fact, haven't been made. So Bembo, which is a great type originally designed for use in Aldus Manutius's Venetian printing shop in, I think it was 1495. It has a wretched, spindly, emaciated, digitized design. If you have Bembo printed in lead today, it's beautiful. It looks quite like it should. But in digital, it's not so good. So there are downsides like that. But the upside of having digital typesetting is, whoa, we have all these faces at our hands. They're inexpensive, and we can make changes that in lead are very, very hard to make. And we can achieve a kind of grace in typesetting, assuming we have the eye and the sensibility and the time to do it, that would have been almost impossible in lead without a great deal of time. So that's one of the real upsides. And of course, we can mix type and image in ways that were really difficult and or impossible before. So I think in the end, in sum, it's given us much more than it's taken. And in the end, you know, much of what it's taken in making bad design easy is up to us to educate people about. You know, if people start to understand that bad design is bad design, then they'll prefer good design. And if we can't convince them of that, well, then I'll go home and start watching television shots of big-hatted cowboys being tolerated by kind horses. That's a Jack Kerouac quotation.
One last question.
So are you positing that there's no such thing as unbiased typesetting in the way there's no such thing as unbiased reporting?
Yes, exactly. Oh, sorry. I'll try to do justice to that very concisely phrased question. Am I positing that there is no unbiased typesetting just as there is no unbiased reporting? And first of all, I agree with your premise. There is no unbiased reporting. Reporting is always done from a position, even when one is just collating what are indisputably facts. One is putting those facts together in a particular relation, getting back to the idea of Gestalt, and that creates a whole that is very different than the sum of the parts. We hope much greater than, and that whole is a very useful addition, but it's different. It's not unbiased. And yes, if I had shown you the frontispiece for the Dickinson book, I have two quotations. One from Melle Hammer, the Dutch designer, whom I showed you a few designs by, and he said, and I paraphrase, "Typography is translation." Then I quote Kakuzo Okakura, who's a Japanese writer that I'm very interested in, and I'm told by someone more informed than me that Okakura was actually quoting someone else. And I forget whom my very literate friend told me he was quoting. But Okakura said, and I quote on the frontispiece of the Dickinson book, "Translation is treason." Now, he's overstating it, but you know, we're making a rhetorical point. And no, I don't regard translation as treason. I don't regard typesetting as treason, but it is bias. It's always mediation. It always adds something, it changes something, and you don't always, as a reader or a viewer, know what it was. Everything is always mediated. It's always incarnate. There's no existence outside the incarnation here. Elsewhere, we hope there is.
Thank you very much, David.